Okay, now that you guys all hate me, at this point, I don't even think Moose likes me anymore. But I still like Moose. So I understand if you basically just want to hit the record button in your brain and then put your head down and take a nap. That's kind of what these lectures after a lab exam turned out to be, but nevertheless, we've got territory to cover and cover it we must. However, one of you, was it Haley, had some questions about the exam perhaps? Is that right? It is Thursday. You're like, it is indeed. Yes, it seems like a very, 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 very close. 48 hours to be exact. Any questions on that? I know what the questions are. Is it all going to be like long essay? Right, that's what you're thinking. No, it's like multiple choice. It's all mostly multiple choice, actually. There's a lot of times a little bit of smattering of stuff on there. It's like usually like short essay, maybe. An essay is such an ugly word, isn't it? Like short. Well, it's not really short answer. I mean, like paragraph, maybe. How about that? Does that qualify? It's a short paragraph, right? Let's follow what it is. It's not short essay, it's short paragraph. At most, right? A lot of times, especially in AMP, a lot of times I'll toss in some like definitional sorts of things, matching sorts of things, that kind of stuff. So it's a little combination of it, but generally speaking, it's the lion's share, but it's probably gonna be multiple choice. Okay. Okay. So first of all, you have to recover from this one, right? So go out, you have to go do your drinking or whatever you need to do to get past this one. Anesthetize yourself. Yeah, right. But then make sure you come back Thursday clear-headed, right? So just try not to destroy too many neurons on the way there. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue covering. We've been talking about our tissues, right? So we covered epithelium, we covered connective. We're kind of still in the middle of connective, right? So we have cartilage that we just got done connective tissue proper. That's where we got finished. So that's kind of like all the dense irregular, collagenous types of tissue. The stuff that you run into a lot, like for instance, you just ran into, all right, a lot of pink stuff on slides, a lot of tissue, a lot of different types of supportive sorts of tissues associated with your organs, like for instance, your skin. Now cartilage, and then eventually bone, has a much more targeted, much more specific type of a structural support. So you don't just see your cartilage anywhere. It's got usually some fairly specified roles, right? So it's a lot more limited. Now, we already talked a little bit about the sites, the blasts, right, and the clasts, right? So the same thing is also true for cartilage. The cartilage is composed of mostly chondrocytes, and like bone, they basically will have little hollowed out spaces in their matrix called lacunae where the chondrocytes live. And it's the same story that we have with bone itself. What sets this one apart is the construction of the matrix. So basically, it's essentially a different mix from bony tissue. And it's not like bone tissue. And so that kind of sets it apart a little bit. When you take a look at your ground substance, we kind of already looked at this one a little bit, right? So we have already in our ground substance, we've already talked about proteoglycans in our ground substance. That one's already there. We already talked about our hyaluronic acid, right? So that's a component of ground substance. We already talked about that one as well. And we already talked about how the combination of these two, right? The cross-linking of these in the ground substance allows you to sort of trap and capture water, which kind of creates moisture and you have water retention basically in a good way, not in a bad way, right? But basically retaining the moisture in this case, your skin, or in this case, in your cartilage, right? So basically you have that sort of wateriness associated with it. Now, why do we need the wateriness in cartilage? Well, the reason why we need it in cartilage is because cartilage is designed to be sort of a little on the flexible side. But also structural. Now, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, aren't those mutually exclusive? Right? If you want to double down on flexibility, you have to give up on structure and vice versa. So the question is then, you can't have them both, right? So if you want one, you have to give up the other. Well, you're absolutely right. However, cartilage overall has components of both. How much of each you have defines what type of cartilage you are. So for instance, you have 3 different types of cartilage. Elastic cartilage is going to have a lot of high flexibility. So you're doubling down on your flexible component. And so you're going to fill your extracellular matrix with flexible types of proteins. Okay. Now, on the fiber cartilage roll, this is going to be a structural type. So you're going to be doubling down on the types of protein fibers in your extracellular matrix that are going to be associated with tough, hard structure. But guess what? You're giving up on flexibility. And then, of course, you have the sweet spot. Somewhere right in the middle, you've got the hyaline cartilage, which is kind of a combination of both. Of course, because of that, you would imagine that this is probably the most common type of cartilage, right? Because usually when you have a ratio like this, one extreme would be fiber cartilage, the other extreme would be elastic cartilage, and then somewhere in the middle would be this sort of wide-ranging sliding ratio with varying amounts of flexibility versus structure, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Okay. So hyaline cartilage is actually the most common of all of them. Okay. And so, as a matter of fact, most of probably what you point at would be hyaline cartilage. So here's a good example. I want you, your anatomy lesson for the day. Not like I haven't beaten you up already, but I just can't resist, right? Point to an area on your body where there is cartilage. It's going everywhere. it's like right. A lot of you guys are pointing at a nose, right? I saw a couple of ears, shoulder. Okay, so all of those are hyaline except for one, the ear. So most of what you associate with cartilage, like joint cartilage and things like that, is hyaline. Your nose, your nasal cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Okay. So it's there for the purposes of support. Now, the important thing to also understand about cartilage, which is not the same thing with bony tissue, is that when you basically make this matrix, you kind of create this ability to sort of this kind of plasticity, right? I mean, if you kind of like wiggle your nasal cartilage around, it got some wiggle to it, right? And it doesn't hurt, right? So you can like punch at it and that sort of stuff. We don't want to punch it too hard, right? Because then that's not a good thing. Right? But I mean, you can move it around and it doesn't hurt at all, right? So number one, it's designed to be flexible, right? At least because it's hyaline cartilage, but it also has no sensation. Why? Because there's no nerve supply to cartilage. So it's not there for you to feel stuff. I mean, let's face it. If you're taking a blow that's hard enough to damage your nose, the nerves that are associated with your bone, your face, that are underlying, that are part of your skin, are going to tell you that story, right? You don't need your cartilage to do that. So in reality, that's not a problem. There's also what's referred to as avascular. What does that mean? There's no blood vessels. Now, if you have no blood vessels, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for the chondrocytes? Now, there's no nutrients, right? Because ultimately your nutrients are coming from your blood. If you don't have any blood source, then how are you going to get nutrients, right? So basically nutrients are by diffusion. Now that's limiting, right? That basically means that you can't get too far away from that original source of nutrients because you don't have any vasculature to feed your cells. So you're limited in how big you can get. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why you don't have a lot of extensive cartilage in your body, is because it's impossible to feed those cells because they outgrow their supply lines. Okay. You can only grow as far as your supply lines will allow you to. And if you're a cell population, then if you don't have supply lines, you got to figure out how to pack a lunch, so to speak, right? So you have to provide supply lines. Either way, if you can't get nutrients to yourself, then you can grow out as far away from your supply lines as you wish. You're going to die, which is a limiting factor on how much cartilage you can have. Okay. That's a perfect example of how the limitations of your structure also limits your function. Okay, that's a common theme, structure, function. Now, the one thing we also, around all cartilage we have, is a liner that's called the perichondrium, chondro for cartilage. This is basically a liner that surrounds cartilage. And so peri means around, chondrium means cartilage. So this is basically around the cartilage. That's basically what this means. This is, there's a couple of different things that are in this particular layer. Most liners in this particular case, especially when you're talking about something, a layer that lines connective tissue, is you have some cellular components, that's true, but you have a very strong connective tissue component, right? Because when you're lining this cartilage, you want to sort of bound it or sort of surround it with sort of a boundary layer, right? And the best way to do that structurally is to do it with connective tissue. That's the reason why a lot of times in these liners you see dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember, that's that collagenous one that we associate with tendons and ligaments. So this is like a sheet or a liner of connective tissue that basically wraps itself around the actual cartilage itself. Now, there's also a cellular layer. So typically, the perichondrium has two pieces: a connective tissue layer, which is this dense, irregular connective tissue component. That's for structure and support, but it's also got a cellular layer, an inner layer. And that's where these fibroblasts are coming in. So the fibroblasts actually inhabit the lower layer of the perichondrium. And the reason why, so let's say, for instance, that I just had, it's not as easy, it's easier to explain it in bone, but it's the same basic idea. Let's say I basically have a piece of cartilage here. So I'm just going to just a general straight, there's no specific shape to cartilage. I'm just going to say there's my piece of cartilage right there. My perichondrium is going to be basically lining the outside of that piece of cartilage, and inside this, so if I were to blow this up, on the outside surface, my outer layer would be composed of connective tissue. This is made by a connective tissue layer. And the inner layer would be composed of cells. And then, of course, I would have my connective tissue, my cartilage down here. So the reason why you have a cellular layer under there, so this is cellular layer, that's your connective tissue layer. The reason why you have that is because let's imagine that you do damage your cartilage. Well, guess what you got to do? You got to repair it. But how do you repair it? Well, with the cells that actually lay down the matrix in the first place. Well, who are they? The chondrocytes. But no, remember, we learned this lesson, didn't we? There's cytes, there's blasts, and there's clasts. Who lays down the tissue originally? The blast. Do we have any blasts around? No, because they're all matured. They've all grown up to be chondrocytes, right? So here you are with your damaged cartilage, and you have the need to replace it with new cartilage, but you don't have a cell population to do that with. So how do you fix that? Well, it's simple. It's with your cellular layer. So the fibroblasts, remember we said that fibroblasts were a type of cell whose job it is to lay down connective tissue during wound healing. And so the fibroblasts are actually going to line the cellular layer. So they're going to actually be in the cellular layer here. And so what they will do is they'll differentiate into chondroblasts. So they will actually be a source of new blast cells. And then you'll be able to lay down new cartilaginous tissue, and you'll be able to fill your damaged area. And then, of course, what happens to the chondroblasts? They grow up, as we all do, right? And then they become chondrocytes. And then now you're back to where you started, right? And that's basically the process of healing of cartilage. The problem is it takes a really long time to heal cartilage. So it's not something that you want to damage. It will take some time to do that, right? Because it's not an immediate process to basically start to kick in the differentiation of these fibroblasts so that you can create new chondroblasts. Okay. Wow, that was a lot going on that slide. Makes no sense whatsoever unless you follow that one in real time. So here's your 3 different types of cartilage, right? So here's your hyaline cartilage, it looks familiar. That hyaline cartilage is one where the matrix itself kind of has this sort of glassy look to it. Kind of looks like spit hair, that sort of smooth, kind of glassy look to it. And then you can see you've got your individual chondrocytes that have hollowed out a little cave for themselves called the lacuna, right? So little opening spaces of lacuna, and they sort of hang out inside there. And so that's your hyaline cartilage. That's the one that you guys saw in the trachea slide. Then, of course, you have fiber cartilage. This one doesn't look like the slide that you guys saw, but basically you have all these collagenous fibers. I think our slides were more of like a whitish type of a color. But these are collagenous fibers. You can see your individual chondrocytes that are laying down a lot of collagen. That's that toughness piece of it, right? So the place where you see this, for instance, is high impact areas. So like your intervertebral discs, right? This is basically forming that intervertebral disc area so that every time you take a step, your disc basically had this kind of like little spongy bit of cartilage that it sort of bounces on. What would happen if you didn't have these discs in there? Basically, you would have bone on bone every time you took a step, and that would be screaming pain. Okay, life would be miserable. There's also other areas like your pubic symphysis is also fiber cartilage. The pubic symphysis is, so when you take a look at your pelvic girdle, where your 2 pubic bones come together, there's a little bit of a gap right there. And there's like a little plug of fiber cartilage in there that separates those 2 pubic bones so that when you walk, you don't get your 2 pubic bones clapping together, right? So that's also an area of fiber cartilage as well. But here you're talking about the other spectrum, right? You're talking about maximum structure and protection. That's what you're talking about here. So you don't see it as commonly in the body as you do with hyaline. Then, of course, elastic cartilage is basically the same basic idea. Notice you still see the lacuna, yes. You still see these open hollow areas. You still see the chondrocytes in there. That's a little nucleus for the chondrocyte in there. But now instead in your matrix, instead of laying down collagen fibers, right, for toughness, now you're laying down these more elastic fibers. And that's going to give you a lot more elasticity. And so your elastic cartilage is going to be your ear, right? Now think about what you can do with your ear. You can basically crush your ear down like this, completely distort the shape of it, and then let it go. It's right back, right? So that's what's now usually the cartilage. Like you're probably thinking, well, wait. How come we don't just use elastic connective tissue, like the connective tissue proper, right? Because we did learn about that one, didn't we? We had collagenous connective tissue, and we have more elastic type of connective tissue. So how come we don't just do like connective tissue proper in the ear itself? The reason is because of the nature of the forces that you have, right? The cartilage is going to be more robust. So it can take more punishment and more beating because that's what your ears take, right? Think of like, putting on, like if you're a motorcycle, like a helmet all the time, or if you're a football player, putting on that helmet all the time. What's happening to those ears as you're slipping that helmet on? It's like, right? I mean, you look like a dog and then all of a sudden they spring back up so you can hear the ear hole, right? So if that's a constant physical distortion, so you need something a little bit more strength oriented than just regular connective tissue with some elastic fibers in it. That's what cartilage gives you. It's like a next level up. It's like, you know what? We do need the elasticity, that's true, but we need something that's going to withstand some serious punishment, because these things are sticking out on the side of our ears and we're going to be beating the devil out of these things. So these have to have some rigor. That's where you kick it up to the next structural level, and that would be the cartilage level. But you still need that flexibility, right? The other big area of elastic cartilage is the epiglottis. What's the epiglottis? Yeah, it's in your gully whopper, right? It's actually not a term. That's what my dad used to call it. Anything down here was like the gully whopper. I just love that one. I'm all like, you know, I gotta hang on to that one. That's just too much. It's not a thing, by the way. Don't put gully whopper on any kind of an exam. Nobody's gonna know what you're talking about. What? Yeah, right. Yeah, a few points for remembering what a gully whopper is. Right. So this is basically the epiglottis, is that little piece of cartilage that separates your esophagus from your trachea. This is one of the reasons why you have the capacity to swallow food without inhaling it. Okay, because as you swallow, the epiglottis folds over because it's elastic cartilage, it's distortable, and it covers your trachea. Yep. And then of course, when you're done swallowing, then it opens it back up so you can breathe. Okay. That's actually a more important version of it.
Gagging on something that went down the wrong way.
Well, no, usually when you're choking on something, what happened was you failed to initiate your swallow mechanism, and instead you literally inhaled it. So your epiglottis will not be triggered unless you initiate your swallow mechanism. So the food will go down in the muscles of your neck, your esophagus will start to contract. And as the food comes in, it'll land on top of the epiglottis because of the way your esophagus is contracting, and it'll bend it over so that it goes down your esophagus and not into your trachea. If you inhale something, which is usually what happens when you're choking on something, that bypasses that. So you're on a totally different mechanism. Your epiglottis is not supposed to close when you're inhaling, but you're not supposed to have stuff going into your trachea. So it's a slightly different mechanism. Okay, so bone. Now we have an entire chapter on bone, so I'm going to introduce this one, but it'll go quickly in the bone physiology section. So similar basic idea, right? So we have a matrix, we have an extracellular matrix that is contained and maintained by the sites, osteocytes in this case, osteo for bone, right? Site for cell, these are bone cells. Now, the question is, what sets bone apart from cartilage? Well, the interesting part is simply the matrix. That's all that separates any of these connective tissues from each other, is simply just the matrix, the way that these cells construct their matrix. So what does bone do that's so different than cartilage, right? And more importantly, why is bone more pervasive than cartilage, right? Yes, right? So the one thing that it does, because of the matrix that it builds, it gives you strength, which is your structure, right? And it's also rigid. Cartilage isn't rigid, is it? Even the most structural stuff is not really all that rigid, right? Even the fiber cartilage isn't all that rigid. But basically, this is there to essentially give you a framework and a structural support. Now, most of your matrix is going to be made of collagen fibers. Oh, hey, that's great. But don't you already have some examples of tissues with collagen fibers in it? How about dense irregular? That's pretty much all collagen, right? But is your body made of dense irregular connective tissue? No, right? How about cartilage? We just said that cartilage has collagen in it, right? The fiber cartilage, those collagenous fibers in there. So why don't you have a lot of cartilage? Why do you have a lot of bone? Well, because you don't just stop there. The innovation of bone isn't in their use of collagen fibers. The innovation of bone is what they do next. Matter of fact, if all you do is lay down your ground substance in your matrix, your collagen fibers, you create a sort of a preliminary type of matrix that we refer to as osteoid. So ground substance plus your proteins equals your osteoid, which is non-calcified bony matrix. This stuff is so soft. So what happens then? How do we harden this stuff up to sort of put this on a new level? Well, what we do is we calcify it. So this is the calcification piece. And how do we do that? We do that with a molecule called hydroxyapatite, which is a combination of calcium and phosphate. So this is one of the reasons why you need calcium and phosphate in your diet while your bones are growing. So what happens is we send our calcium and our phosphate into a reaction that creates another molecule called hydroxyapatite. This is the hardener. By the way, if you're a fan of masonry, cement, for instance, right? Cement isn't just the dry, rocky powder, right? That's not what makes cement. That's just a mud brick, which will fall apart as soon as it dries out. What sets cement apart and most hard, like masonry pieces, is the curing agents, right? So there's a curing agent that sets concrete apart from all other types of masonry that causes that sort of powdery matrix to solidify to another level of strength, right? This is what the Romans invented. They invented concrete. And so that's like was something that nobody had ever done before. Everybody was just using sun-baked mud bricks and stuff like that, right? Stuff that weathers very easily. It'll be destroyed very easily. Or what they did was they chipped out stone, right? They took either granite and they just quarried it and they just chipped away at it because it wouldn't weather. But that's a lot of labor, right? I mean, if you're trying to build like a big old temple or something like that, or like the pyramids, for instance, I mean, you have to pick your rock very carefully, right? Because if you go after granite, which is a very hard, dense rock, you're consuming lifetimes of work of masonry, just chiseling away on that, trying to chip that thing into the blocks that you need to get it into. And not only that, but it's massively heavy, right? So good luck moving that once you get it chipped away, right? But then it's not successful if all you're doing is mud bricks because it's not hard enough, right? I mean, yeah, you could build a structure and it'll last a little while, but it's not going to have staying power because mud just basically falls apart. It always goes back to mud. So the Romans invented concrete because they said, well, let's take this ground stone powder and then let's add this curing agent to it. Once we add that curing agent to it, we get concrete. It sets up hard. And that's exactly what's going on here. Hydroxyapatite is the curing agent that sets up the bone, otherwise soft bony matrix, into its really hard concrete structure that we know concrete for. Okay. This is a massive innovation. This is the reason why most of our structure, even now in the 21st century, hinges on what was essentially a Roman discovery, which is crazy. So essentially our buildings are Roman technology. Yeah, it's kind of wild, right? We haven't really upgraded since the Romans. That's how great they were. They're also great at killing people, by the way. Just saying, there are a couple things that Romans are great at. Engineering, they're great in engineering. No question about that. Never doubt a Roman, right? Never count them out. They'll engineer their way out of anything. And the other thing is also they killed a lot of people. And they're really good at it too. So they're really good at it, which is not something you want to be good at, but that's, I guess there it is. But anyway, right, so ultimately, the other thing that you also want to remember is that, now let's foil this against the cartilage, right? So osteocytes, as they're sort of making this matrix, they kind of have their little hollowed out area, right, their little lacuna, and then they set this up and it sets up hard. Well, guess what? That little lacuna is inside bone. Right, and so you guys saw that, right? You guys saw that on the exam, that bony tissue one with the little osteocyte associated with it. Now that's hard bone, that's solid bone, right? So you kind of have this little hollowed out cave, and you sort of like, you're kind of screwed, aren't you? You're like, okay, crap, I just basically solidified myself into this little cave here, and now how do I get out, right? Right, so that's a bad idea. So you obviously have to have some sort of supply, but the osteocytes, they do have a supply. They don't basically let themselves get just, pinned in to like a crypt, essentially. They have a supply. Did you guys notice, by the way, this is a compact bone, right? Compact bone is driven by that structure called the osteon, where you have your central canal, which is your blood supply, and then you have these concentric rings of bony tissue laid down. And then you'll have these like little osteocytes inside their little hollow lacuna. And then you'll kind of see these little guys just sort of maintaining their little rings. Look familiar? You're like, darn it, that's what that question was. Yeah, that's what that was, right? So the question is, how do you get the blood supply from here? So this is your blood to that cell. How many of you guys noticed like what looks like little stress fractures, lateral little stress fractures like that? Those aren't stress fractures. Those are what's called canaliculi. These are like little vessels that basically funnel blood from the blood supply in the center to the osteocyte. So it's kind of like you've built yourself a cave, that's true, but you have all these like little tunnels inside your little lacuna where you have these like little blood vessels, these little canaliculi feeding you nutrients. So it's like a little porthole. Okay. And so that's the nature of compact bone. So compact bone is basically this kind of osteon structure. That's compact bone. Spongy bone, on the other hand, is spongy. So it looks like a sponge, right? So it doesn't have these osteons in it. So it's a different structure. And it has more of this kind of like rib-like trabeculum look. So here's kind of what it looks like. So this is spongy bone up here. So you can see you've got basically these kind of rib-like structures that you kind of lay down with all these little nooks and crannies. So this is like open space in here where your blood cells or whatever can inhabit. And then you kind of have these little ribs or partitions or walls of bone, right? So this is bone that's laid down by these osteoblasts. So that's spongy bone. Why? Because when you take a look at it overall, you can see it looks like a sponge. So you can see like all these little nooks and crannies in there. So it looks like a sponge. That's why they call it spongy bone. Okay. Now, compact bone, on the other hand, that's interesting. That's the first time I noticed that one. How many of you guys caught that mistake? Dense, irregular, elastic connective tissue. Okay, that's clearly not dense, irregular, elastic connective tissue. This is compact bone. All right, because we've already seen that, haven't we? We saw that one in connective tissue proper. So we know what that looks like. It definitely doesn't look like this, right? So here's your osteon. Does that look familiar? Does that look like the slide you guys have been looking at for the bone? Yeah, right. So here you can see your central canal. That's your blood supply right there. You can see these concentric rings and all these like little lines like that. So you can see you don't just have a couple, you got a lot of them there. Feeding blood from the central canal, and they're connecting to these osteocytes to make sure they get nourished. Okay. So it's like Meals on Wheels. Right. You're homebound, you're lacuna bound, basically in this case. So you need somebody to deliver you some food. Okay. Okay, so that's bone. And we got our own chapter for bone. So we'll take a look at that more. And so we won't spend as much time in the bone physiology chapter when we get to that point. But the other type of connective tissue we have is blood, right? This is fluid connective tissue. And basically the reason why they call this connective tissue is because it's a support structure. It supports cells in the fluid itself. So when you take a look at blood and you spin it down, it's got a couple of things in it, right? So if you spin down your blood, there's something that looks like this. So this basically up here is your straw-colored fluid. This is your plasma. That's the liquidy part, of which like 92% of it is water. And then down here, what you have is what's called your formed elements. Most of which, like 99.9% of this, is red blood cell. So up here in this little layer here is your white blood cells. So you're talking about maybe about 0.1% of your overall formed elements. They're part of the white blood cell group. So when we say there's 0.1% of it is white blood cell, we add the platelets into that group. No, platelets are separate. Yep. So this is your cells, right? And then in your cells that are supported by the fluid portion of the blood. So you basically have this kind of fluidy matrix that basically supports these cells. That's why it's considered a connective tissue. And so here you can kind of see you've got your sample of blood. A lot of you guys saw this, right? So you have your white blood cells here, and you can see they're kind of floating around with your red blood cells, and they're basically in this sort of plasma-like fluid. Okay, and so that's your fluid connective tissue. Of the connective tissues, probably the least talked about. I mean, you usually talk about, you don't think of it as a connective tissue. You talk about blood in the blood chapter as part of the cardiovascular system. That's usually what you do. Okay. But it is technically a connective tissue. So is hematopoietic tissue. So this is basically the marrow. So this is kind of like the substrate. So if you take a look at this tissue itself, basically what you have is a lot of fat cells. So that's what this guy here is. So this is a fat cell. But you see this kind of matrix of cells that sort of surrounds these sort of developing cells. So these are basically developing cells in the marrow. And the marrow can be thought of as sort of like a supportive gamish of fluids and some solids, some connective tissue types of things, that's all kind of soaked into this spongy area. So it's kind of part and parcel with the spongy area. Not all textbooks, by the way, list this one as a connective tissue because of its close association with the spongy bone. Okay, so it's kind of hard to separate the difference between the spongy bone and this actual hematopoietic fluid portion of it. Okay, think of it sort of like a sponge that's been soaked in water, right? So in this case, the water is sort of harboring a bunch of these cells that are busy developing. That's your white blood cells, red blood cells. And so in that sense, it's very much like blood because it's creating a sort of a support background for these cells, but it's actually itself kind of encouched in the spongy bone, right, in the sponge itself. Okay. So it's kind of, that's one of the reasons why some textbooks won't really cover it. But you can see adipose tissue is part of this story, part of this tissue, and there's other pieces to it as well. So connective tissue, the summary, right? Yeah, right. So but in time for the next exam you'll take. So kind of couched right in between the two of them. So we have our connective tissue proper, right, of which we have loose connective tissues, which we have areolar, adipose, and reticular tissues. So those are your loose. Then you have your dense connective tissues, where you have your two dense irregulars and either collagenous or elastic. So you have your dense irregular and your dense regulars. And then, of course, you have your fluid connective tissue, which are these guys down here. And then on this side of things, you have your more supportive types of connective tissues with more targeted specific support roles in terms of your three types of cartilage, right? So elastic, hyaline, and fibro. And then, of course, your bone, which in this case, we only have compact bone, but you also have spongy bone as well, right? And so that's the pantheon of connective tissue. So here's the cool thing, right? You thought epithelial tissue had a lot in it. Connective tissue has any more. So what's the common theme that's screaming at you in connective tissue? Is when you build stuff in the body, you also have to support it, right? So there's a lot of this kind of filling the gaps with something. You don't just leave empty space, right? So there's a lot of underlayment, if you will, right, that goes into the building of tissues. That underlayment, if you will, is the connective tissue. And you have different types of underlayment. Some of it is simply cosmetic in the sense of like skin, cosmetics like skin, not like cosmetic that it doesn't have a role to just look at it, but cosmetic like in skin. But the others are more structural. They're designed to withstand punishment, right? And others are more physiological in nature, but you have different types of functions you need to always acquire. But the common theme across all connective tissues is they're all supportive. They're either going to allow you some flexibility if you need that, or they're going to allow you some structure if you need that. And there's different levels of flexibility and structure that you can build into your connective tissue to make your function perfect in terms of what you want to do. Okay. Muscle tissue. How about those muscles? Well, okay, so first of all, muscle is essentially the contractile tissue. Its job essentially is simply to contract, which basically means it shortens the muscle fibers. These guys are vascular, obviously. You need blood to feed these muscle cells. And you have three major types. Skeletal tends to be long and cylindrical in nature, and they tend to have striated. So this is a really important piece of it. So striations, that means they have those little lines on them, and they're voluntary. It means you have control of them. If I were to ask you, point to a muscle, probably most of you would point to a skeletal muscle. Okay. Mostly because if you tried to point to a non-skeletal muscle or some other muscle, you couldn't actually point to it because it's inside you, right? So this is what we think about, like when we do exercise physiology or whatever, anything like that. We're dealing with skeletal muscles. When you're working out, it's skeletal muscles. Okay. Cardiac. This is your heart, right? That's it. There is nothing else on the table. That's all it is, right? So you've got a special type of musculature, a special type of muscle just for the heart itself. Now, it's also striated. We'll learn what those striations are when we get to the muscle physiology chapter, and it's involuntary, right? So you don't get to tell this one what to do, which is probably a good thing, right? Because how many of you guys would forget to tell the heart what to do? Well, let's put it this way. You'll forget exactly once. And then you won't have to worry about it again. Right, that's the upside of it in some sort of a dark way. Right, so it's involuntary. And in the cardiovascular, you have an entire chapter on heart in A&P2. And you learn about the heart, the structure of the heart, the function of the heart, the physiology of the heart, and everything about the heart. And then, of course, you have smooth muscles, which are not striated, and they're involuntary as well. So that's a good thing, right? So you don't want to have to tell your esophagus, for instance, that you need to swallow your food, because otherwise you'd have to be thinking it all the way down, right? And that's a lot of work for your brain to do. You don't have to tell your stomach to churn the food you just ate, right? Because you have to think your food all the way through. Literally, once you ate something, you would be able to do nothing useful with yourself until you got that done. Because you'd be like, okay, stomach, come on, send it to the small intestines. There you go, right? I mean, it would be weird, right? And that's all you'd be doing. So what is your predator looking at? Wow, free meal, because you're occupied, aren't you? So I think I'll just step in here and have myself a bite, because you're too busy trying to move your food through your tube, right? So to speak. So smooth, helpful, right? And so there's a lot. So usually when you look at skeletal, that's like A&P1, right? You learn about sort of the mechanical nature of your ambulation. That's a fancy way of saying how you move, right? And where does that discussion start? With your frame, first of all, right? So you learn about your bones and all the little nubbies on those bones. Nubbies, that's not a technical term. That's a knee term. That's right after gollywhopper. Right? So you learn like all the little divots and dings and depressions and bumps and things like that, right? Why? Because there's muscles attached to that. There's nerves running through that. There's blood vessels running through that. So these are important things. They're not just random. They're there for a reason and they do a job. And so you learn all that. Why? Because the next step after that is learning your muscles. Okay, great. Now that we got a skeleton, let's start stringing some muscles up on this. Let's learn what these muscles do and how they move and what our range of motion is so that we can start to determine what kinds of movements we can make. Okay. And so that's all A&P1, that's all skeletal. And then when you get an A&P2, it all turns into physiological. So you learn about the mechanics of the cardiac muscle, not because you're interested in cardiac muscle per se, as much as you're interested in how to make the heart work. And you need cardiac muscle to do that. As you start to move through your digestive system and other organs, you need to be able to have local contractions in order to get those organs to work. And so all of a sudden now you're talking about smooth muscle. Not because you really care so much about smooth muscle as much as you need smooth muscle to work in order to get your organs to do what you want them to do. Okay. So you can see that the other two tend to have very strong physiological connections to them. And you can't really understand them in totality unless you study them alongside their physiological role. Okay. So here's your skeletal muscle. You can see long cylindrical muscle, oftentimes multiple nuclei in it, but you can see very strong striations. We'll learn about what those striations are in the muscle physiology chapter, but you can see very long cylindrical sorts of things. And that's basically most of what your skeletal muscles are. That's you. Oh, there's somebody at the door? The Ghost of Science building. Let's see if there's somebody outside. Just me, Moose. No, it's clear. That's cute. I got to hear Moose. Yeah. It could be somebody walked by or something like that or whatever. So then we have cardiac muscle, right? So if you take a look at it, it's a little bit different in the sense that cardiac muscle, unlike skeletal muscle, is actually interconnected. So if you take a look at the muscle fibers, which is like a fancy term for cells, muscle cells, you can see they have these little cross-lateral sort of connections that kind of connects them together. So they're kind of like sort of woven together, basically. The other thing you also see is these little dark lines, which are called intercalated discs. This basically connects the cells end to end to each other. And they're basically filled with what's called gap junction. So this is how the cells communicate back and forth to each other. Gap junction, if you remember from your general bio, which we had it. Should have. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just one way the cells connect each other. And it's kind of like a sieve, right? They're open channels that literally connects one cell to another, to another, to another. So it's free communication between these cells, which is critical for a heart, because the idea of the heart is you don't just want to contract, you want to be able to contract in unison. That means basically when one cell gets the signal to contract, everybody gets the signal to contract. So they all hear it at the same time. It's kind of like me giving you an instruction, like on the count of three, everybody jump. 1, 2, 3. You can do it, right? Because you all heard it at the same time. That's what intercalated discs do for cardiac cells. So when the heart says contract, everybody hears it across the heart and the entire organ can contract all at once in unison. Okay. And then of course we have our smooth muscle, which looks like gummy worms, kind of sliding along each other. And so these tend to be like long, sort of tubular worm-like cells that will tend to basically contract. And they don't contract a lot, right? You're not going to lift heavy loads with your smooth muscle. It's not going to be able to happen. You're just trying to move small, local, very fine movements of an organ where a very fine movement will kind of give you great physiological impact. Okay. So that's kind of what the smooth muscle looks like. Okay. That's the end of muscle tissue. Again, we have a muscle physiology chapter. We'll take a look at that. And obviously in A&P1, we focus a lot on skeletal because we're going to unpack cardiac in A&P2. Okay. The last tissue, of the four, right? The nervous tissue. This is your conductive tissue. What does that mean? Conduction means to send something, or to send, in this case, signals. And it helps to coordinate. Now, typically in this tissue, you've got a couple of different things going on here. You've got neurons themselves, which will basically create these electrical signals, basically like a voltage that moves along the cell. And we call that an action potential. So this is a moving voltage. So that's what that is. And a neuron has certain parts to it. So it has what's called a cell body. So I'm going to draw the classic motor neuron. So the cell body is like your usual normal cell. So this is your cell body here. Oftentimes referred to as the soma, because soma is Greek for body. It also has an axon, which is kind of a long extension that it basically uses like a wire to transmit its electrical impulse down the axon. That's where the message goes down. And then it also has smaller ones that are attached to the cell body that are called dendrites. So these are dendrites. And this one is an axon. So incoming messages will come into the dendrites from other places, other neurons perhaps, or something like that. And all these messages will come in. And then what will happen is the cell body will receive all these incoming messages, sort them all out, try to make sense out of them, and then it'll make some sort of a decision. So, okay, based on what I've just heard, there's a lot of different things going on. Then I'm going to make some sort of a decision, and I'm going to send my final response out through my axon to some other target. Okay. If you're a motor neuron, you're sending that out to a muscle to tell that muscle to contract. Okay. So that's basically the neuron. And there's different types of neurons based on how many of these little branches are attached to the cell body. So if you got a bunch of them, it's multipolar. If there's only one coming in, one going out, it's bipolar. Pseudo-unipolar is one where you only have one really major branch that's connected to the cell body. That's called, sometimes it's called unipolar. In this case, they make the difference to pseudo. We'll talk about that actually when we get to the neurophysiology chapter. We'll unpack that a lot. The other thing actually that we have in the tissue is what's called glial cells. These are support cells. So a neuron is highly specialized. So specialized, it can't actually do normal cell functions. Normal cell stuff. Like what? Like eat? I mean, it's literally so specialized. It doesn't even know how to eat anymore. So it's kind of like, you know, it's like a person who needs an attendant. It's like, you know what? I'm just like so focused on what I'm doing, I can't even stop to eat. So why don't you just spoon feed me, right? So I've got an entourage. It sounds like Ariana Grande, right? She has people carry her on stage all the time. It's like, well, you got legs, use them. I mean, honestly, what are you, 20 something? I mean, get the hell on your feet and use them, right? It's like, but anyway, I thought that was kind of fun, but just it's because when I heard further, I'm like, seriously, you actually make people do that, like your bodyguards or whatever. It's like, okay, so yeah, use your feet. But anyway, so these guys are support cells. So what do? Well, they do the stuff that normal cells do, but neurons can't because they're so specialized on transmitting messages back and forth. So what is that? Nourishment. They actually have a set of cells in the glial cell department that actually nourishes, or whose job it is to feed the neurons. The neurons don't feed themselves like a normal cell does. They need protection. They can't protect themselves. So they got an outpost of cells whose job it is to protect them, right? Like a bodyguard division. They have insulators. So they can't actually kind of protect themselves and put the little cozy on themselves. They got to have somebody else do that. right? Think about this. Does the neuron sound like a big baby? Yeah, they're pretty much a big baby, right? As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the neuron, one of my favorite analogies of a neuron is, oh gosh, what is this movie? Starship Troopers. Really bad movie, actually. But I just couldn't stop watching it. It's like where a bunch of bug-like aliens are attacking humans, and you got a group of people who like went through college, like cadet school or something like that, and they all kind of became different things. I think like one guy became like the nerd guy because he was super smart, and the other guy was kind of a little on the not so bright side, so he became infantry. They just basically put him in the front lines to like die, basically. But anyway, in control of these like bug-like aliens was the brain bug, who was like the master bug, and it was just like this big, disgusting looking, sort of blobbish looking bug that had like attendants. And these attendants would kind of like attend to its needs. And the reason why I like it is because it basically the way it fed was, and the way it got smart, it wasn't like feeding thing. It kind of like accumulated the intelligences of all of its victims. So instead of like eating its brains, it would like have this proboscis where it basically stick it into the person's skull and suck the brains out. It was really cool, actually. But it wouldn't like eat it. It would add that collective intelligence like to its own intelligence. So that's why they called the brain bug, is because it had the collective intelligence of all of the victims that it had. But it was funny because this thing literally was useless. I mean, it had all these little attendants like taking care of it. It was just so like useless. And that's kind of what the neuron's like. Really, really good at what it does. But it needs a lot of help, right? It needs somebody to feed it. So that's kind of what a multipolar looks like. You can see multiple poles. So here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. So you have lots of different poles coming into the body. That's a multipolar. That's actually a classic look for a motor neuron. So a neuron that's sending signals out to your muscles. Okay, that's a kind of a classic one. If you take a look at other types of neurons, so this is your pseudo unipolar. So here's your single pole right there, and then this is your cell body right there. So you can see you only have one inlet to that cell body. So that's your pseudo unipolar, and then they didn't have bipolar, but those you see like in your retina, for instance, your rods and your cones, the sensory cells in your eye, those are bipolar in nature. They have like one little sensory twig coming out that's receiving light information, and another one that's connected to the optic nerve. All right, so those two poles. So you see bipolar there. So we talked a little bit about the serous membrane, yes? Yes. So this is a little bit of review, but we want to add a couple more to these membranes because the membranes are important, right? So you have a couple of different major types of membranes. You have mucous membranes. And we've already learned, we will learn about the cutaneous, right? There's actually 4 different membranes. There's cutaneous, which is skin. We'll learn about that one in chapter 5. It's got its own chapter, right? And then we have mucous, serous, and synovial. So we've already talked a little bit about serous membranes, right? We had that parietal and the visceral layer with a little space in between them. So we had that one already. But mucous membranes are also important because why? They secrete mucus. Now, if you recall, mucus is a very variable fluid. It can be either runny or it can be thick, but it's always produced by goblet cells. So if you recall, we talked a little bit about goblet cells, right? And these are cells that are basically going to be founded on a basement membrane. Why? Because that's always what you do. Epithelial cells, that's what these guys are. Epithelial cells will always be tacked onto a basement membrane, and that will then be founded on a type of connective tissue, which is, in this case, the lamina propria, right? So you see the same basic structure over and over and over again. Epithelial liner glued onto a basement membrane, glued onto a connective tissue layer, in this case, always referred to as lamina propria. Lamina propria is a general term that you'll see in a lot of different areas, but it always has the same structure. It's the connective tissue support structure that usually the basement membrane is attached to. That's always the case with lamina propria. And it's usually a very superficial type of connective tissue. It's usually up there near the surface. But you see mucus basically wherever you see openings to the outside of the body, right? So respiratory system, we talked about the respiratory mucus that captures dust particles in your respiratory. You have urinary mucus, you have reproductive mucus, digestive mucus. So anything, notice these all have commonalities to them, don't they? These are all open to the outside world. So oftentimes you're going to be lined with this mucus layer if you're open to the outside world. So serous membranes, we already talked a little bit about, right? So we have basically a three-part system. You have your pericardial or this is for the cardiac system. You have your pleural, which is for the lungs, and peritoneals, which is for the digestive system. But it always has the same thing, right? So you have your parietal layer, which covers the cavity. You have your space, and you have your visceral layer, which covers the organ. That's always going to be the pattern that you see. So your serous liners that cover your heart and your pericardial cavity is the pericardial serous membranes. The ones that are associated with covering your lungs and your pleural cavities are your pleural serous membranes. And the ones that are associated with your abdominal cavity, which are covering your organs, your digestive organs and your abdominal cavity, are the peritoneal. So whenever you're talking about peritonitis or peritoneal activities, it's talking about your peritoneal cavity. That is your abdominal cavity. The other type of membrane, not cutaneous, because we'll talk about that one in chapter 5, is synovial. These are associated with movable joints. And essentially what synovial fluid does is it basically produces hyaluronic acid, which lubricates the movable joints. Synovial fluid is very, very specific, and there's a membrane that produces that synovial fluid. Anybody heard of water on the knee? Yeah, that's synovial fluid. That's usually a buildup, an overproduction of synovial fluid in the knee joint, to the point where oftentimes it starts to create abnormal pressures and problems structurally. So it has to be drained out. And normally it's associated with irritation of the synovial membrane, which causes them to secrete more because they're thinking, oh, well, wait a minute, this really hurts. So we have to secrete more in order to slick it up a little bit, right? So if I just grease it a bit more with my lubricating hyaluronic acid, then it's not going to hurt as much. Well, the problem is if it's due to damage, then that hurt never goes away and you just accumulate fluid and that starts to cause other problems. Okay. But that's what the water on the knee is. It's basically synovial fluid that's being produced by the synovial membrane. We'll learn more about that one a little later on when we talk about joints. So here's your internal membrane. So you can see you have your respiratory membranes, your digestive serous membranes, right, associated with your cavity. So your mucous membranes are up here with your respiratory and your digestive. You also have serous membranes associated with your abdominal cavities. And then you have your synovial down here, usually associated with your joints. For the most part, it's usually your knees because your knees are actually the most mobile of all of your joints. It's also the joint that probably takes the most punishment in your body. Your shoulder's pretty close. Yeah, your hip is also a good one. Actually, anything in the triad, hip, knee, ankle, those three take a lot of punishment. But the reason why your knee is really bad is because that's the confluence of your tibia and your femur. And so oftentimes when you take a strike on the ground, you feel it there first before it gets to your hip. So the shock radiates up your leg. Your ankle gets it pretty badly, but you've got a lot of different bones in your ankle that kind of buffer that a little bit, and a lot of soft tissue, but it radiates immediately like a jackhammer into your knee. And then what's left over will slowly dissipate up your femur into your hip. So ideally speaking, by the time it gets to your hip, it's been muted quite a bit. It does have greater range of motion than your knee, but the best range of motion is clearly your shoulder, because even though, and we'll learn about that when we get into the joint chapter, right? So what if you damage these things, right? So if you damage these tissues, well, obviously you're going to kick in inflammation, right? And so that's basically an immune response. So basically inflammation is designed to protect you. And so ultimately what's going to happen is it's going to come in here. It's going to be a defense against infection. So these are bad guys, right? Because the idea is you've injured yourself at this particular point. Now you have an influx of bad guys coming in. So you're going to basically mount an attack against whatever bad guys come in. You're also going to start cleaning up and basically managing damage. So you got to clean up the damage. And then the next thing is repair, right? Those three: protect yourself, clean up the mess, fix it, right? That's basically wound healing in a nutshell. Don't try that one on the boards. It's not going to work. You got to know a little bit more than that. But that's basically it, right? Basically, it's the same idea. And inflammation is essentially your initial response in order to facilitate these activities. All these activities require players, cells to do this work. And so you need to be able to actually recruit those cells to the site of injury. And that requires you to sort of do a couple of things, right? So like, for instance, do what your chemical mediators are trying to do, like histamines, for instance, kinins, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes. These basically are chemical signals that help to recruit cells and facilitate their delivery to the site. So think about what you got to do. Dilate those blood vessels, right, to make way so you can get those cells there so they can start cleaning things up. And when you dilate that, guess what's going to happen? You're going to get more blood, which means you're going to get redness in the area. As these cells start to invade the tissue, they come out of your bloodstream. And then what happens? They start to accumulate in the connective tissue because they're doing their job. That creates swelling. You've got pain receptors in there that are triggering, right? Because that's all part of your sensation in there. And then, of course, heat. Why? Because of the increased vascular nature. So your blood is hot and red. So if you dilate your blood vessels, which is what histamine does, then you're going to get more red blood there, it means redness, and more heat there, heat. And those cells are going to exit the blood into the tissues, which is going to create swelling. Okay, so all the aspects of inflammation are all associated with the general role of inflammation to recruit exactly the players that are needed for get the bad guys, clean the mess up, fix it. Okay, that's what inflammation does. By the way, pain, which is a good thing, is how your body knows that it needs help, right? And so what happens then is in order to make sure that you're stimulating and that your brain is clear on the lesson, it's like, hey, we're hurting here. This is painful. You need to get it here because this is where it hurts. Then what you do is you increase your pain reception in that area. That's kind of like a siren to basically tell the rest of your body. It's like, listen, you need to put your resources where it hurts because that's where you're having problems. Okay, and that's what pain is for. Then, of course, eventually you're going to move stuff in there. Your white blood cells are going to get in there. Your tissue is going to swell, and that's going to basically create what edema. So this is basically water accumulation in your connective tissue. And that comes with the tissue. So when cells are moving from your blood vessels into your connective tissue, water comes with it typically. And that basically causes the swelling. That's the reason why injuries swell. So the inflammation response. So this is kind of like this is basically a more organized version of what we just talked about, right? So basically you injure yourself. So like, here's a nice little splinter. I'm going to be nice to you. Notice how it cuts through the skin, through the epidermis, it cuts into the connective tissue. And then of course it's delivering all sorts of bad guys there, right? So you can see some bad guys going on in there. And so you got to do some work in there. So not only that, but you've lacerated blood vessels, and then you start to see some of the white blood cells going on. So let's take a look at number one. So at this particular point, at your point of damage, you start to kick in inflammation, which is releasing these chemical messengers, histamines, kinins, prostaglandins, things like that. And then what these guys are going to start to do is these guys are going to start to get to work to recruiting cells to the site it needs to be fixed, right? So that's step number one. Then in response to these histamines, step number two, which is this right here, you can see that you're going to dilate your blood vessels, and that's going to give you that redness, right? And some of the swelling going on, because some of those are going to start going into the tissue now. And all those white blood cells are going to be coming to the site of injury. They're going to start moving out into the connective tissue where the bad guys are. So you can see this right here. So you can see these guys are arriving on the scene and they're moving out. So they're going to go out here and do battle with these little green guys, right? So that's kind of what's happening at that particular point. And that's the reason why it's starting to get swollen, is because of that extra movement of fluid into the connective tissue at that point. So swelling in a lot of ways is actually a good thing. That's what's supposed to happen. Well, icing the injury reduces the swelling, but usually you ice the injury because if you have too much swelling, it can start to create physical problems for surrounding structures. So even though swelling is a sign of a good thing, you don't necessarily want things to like swell without bound, because then you start to create problems for nearby tissues. And then you're just kind of exacerbating things. And so keeping the swelling down doesn't change the activities. You're still doing your attack. You're still doing all that. It just keeps the tissue from distorting too much. Okay. And that's a good thing. Then what's going to happen is all the clotting proteins are going to come in. So you can see, like, you got red blood cells that are spilling out. You got clotting proteins that are coming in. Immune cells are just, that's a full-on immune attack at this particular point. So you can see all these immune cells coming in. So you can see you've got more of these. These are neutrophils, by the way, it looks like. So these guys are coming out and they're just basically going on the attack. They're just everywhere. So it's a full-on battle at this point. You've escalated to a full-on battle. And not only that, but you can see these little guys right here. These are platelets, which are basically going to start plugging up the injury. So the site, the lacerations, is going to start plugging up the clotting. So the clotting proteins will basically plug the hemorrhage, plug the bleeding, get that bleeding to stop. You don't want that to keep going forever, right? At that level. So you can start to see, you start getting a lot of these different players. The immune system's involved now. The cleanup crew is involved now. The platelets are involved now. So you can see there's lots of different response teams coming in now at this particular point in the third step. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So then when you get to the actual tissue repair, you kind of form your little blood clot. So this is a plug. So this basically plugs the hole, so you're not bleeding out. But then, so this is what's called the hematoma stage, right? But then what happens is, now that you got this plug, now what you can do is you can come over here to step number 2, and you're kind of forming a scab now. But now what's going to happen is you can start to rebuild this process. So number 2 is you're rebuilding. So this is your wounded tissue. But once you actually form this little layer now around this wounded tissue, is you can start to rebuild and fill in new tissue into that area. So you can see how you're starting to fill that in now. All of a sudden, so you can see this is this gap now is smaller, but you basically laid in now what's called granulation tissue. This is connective tissue filler. So you have to lay down new connective tissue to replace the old connective tissue that you busted up, right? And so you do that with granulation tissue, but as you're doing that, you're sort of shallowing up this cavity. It's getting better and better. So you're kind of shallowing this up a little bit, and you're going to keep laying down granulation tissue. So you can see how now you've basically gone through and you've filled all this whole area that used to be a big gaping wound with filler, right? This granulation tissue. And now you've restored the surface anatomy. So this is your epidermis, right? So now you've restored your epidermis back to normal. And at this point, your scab can fall off because now you've got healthy skin underneath. You just got this irregularity in connective tissue here, right? And so if that irregularity is big enough, it'll push up through the epidermis and you'll see it as a ridge of connective tissue. And we call that a scar. Okay, so scar is basically just dense, irregular connective tissue that sort of heaps up and that's kind of irregular from everything else because it's laid down at a different time. You're just sort of filling it all in just to kind of plug that hole and to restore that connective tissue piece. Okay, that's what scars are. So what I want to do is I want to stop here. Well, actually, yeah, I want to stop here. And I'll finish up the last two chapters. Thank you. You're like, please, yeah, please mean slides and not chapters. Yes, I heard the silence in there. Yes, the last two slides, but I want to allow a little bit of time because a lot of times students will have questions, especially when we talk about things like cancer and aging with respect to tissues and so forth. So I want to allow a little bit of time to properly unpack that and to give you guys a chance to sort of chew on that and ask curiosity questions and things like that before we dive into chapter 5. Yes, so